In a dark, spooky world where fear takes over, get ready to face the unknown. Welcome to a place where nightmares come alive, where shadows hide secrets, and every breath sends shivers down your spine. Take a deep breath as you step into a realm that will test your courage. Lock your doors, hold on to hope, for within these depths, something sinister awaits. Prepare yourself for a journey into true terror. Contrary to rumor, I hadn't the slightest inkling about the true source of the garbage smell when I was growing up. I believed my father when he told me it was just the pipes in the walls. You see, I had a very ordinary girlhood, playing with other children in our quiet little cul-de-sac in our sleepy neighborhood, shaded by oak and sycamore trees. There were whispers, of course, of a predator, and an undercurrent of fear. But like most children, I remained blissfully secure in my certainty that the adults in my life would protect me. Indeed, in all my wildest imaginings, I couldn't have conceived that behind my father's gentle smile was a man who could murder my playmates in cold blood, chop apart their bodies, and stash them behind the walls. But there were signs. He kept an axe downstairs in the basement, always sharp, yet we had no chimney or fireplace or any wood to chop. Our home underwent frequent renovations to fix leaky pipes or add improvements like false walls. Strangely, it was often after these adjustments that a rank, rotting odor would permeate. When my father finally confessed, I learned that the murders began long before my first memories of the disappearances. Began before I was born, in fact. It was my mother who was afflicted. He never knew where the affliction came from, just that after I was born, mere days after, in fact, she tried to strangle me. He saved me just in time, and she was hospitalized for postpartum psychosis. My father bottle-fed me, my sole caretaker during my mother's intensive treatment. She came back restored, and their lives returned to the normal joy of newlyweds with a cherished infant. Until the evening he found her bleeding out in the bathtub, and me unresponsive, drowned beside her. Frantic, he scooped me out and rushed to revive me, wept when I finally coughed and drew breath, screamed at my mother while desperately trying to bind her wrists. But she grabbed hold of him and said, sobbing, I tried. All I wanted was an ordinary, normal life. Then she whispered something to him that, in the moment, he assumed must have been a sign of her madness. She bled out before he could save her. What did she say? I asked, sitting across from him in the cramped interview room where he confessed to me. That she was sorry, but it wouldn't let her die without. His next words were mumbled so quietly I missed them. I echoed. It made me do all this. I had to, or it wanted me to hurt you. Dad, what is it? You're saying you're possessed. That it's some kind of demon. He sighed, ran his fingers, dark with blood from picking at the scabs on his arms, through his unwashed hair. It was strange to see him in such a filthy state. He was normally so well kept, almost effete. A demon. Yes, he said tiredly. So why didn't you try an exorcism? Call a priest or something. The whole demon excuse sounded like bullshit. I tried. He burst. Don't you think I tried? It started right after your mother died. These small, tiny urges, almost insignificant. I'd see you sleeping so soundly there, and I'd think, what if I put the pillow over her? What if I squeezed her tiny little hand until it bled? What if instead of tickling those little toes, I just bit them off? Dad. I recoiled, disgusted. I didn't want these thoughts. He shouted, fingers curled into claws that he raked across the back of his neck. I didn't want them. They came in, and they got louder, more insistent. I couldn't tune them out. I don't know what it was, or I thought it was just a sickness in me. I went to doctors, psychiatrists. I doped myself up. I tried priests, prayer, and yes, I did a fucking exorcism. My father never swore. It was strange to hear coming from his mouth. I tried all of it, but it wouldn't stop. The only thing that made the voices still was what? I asked as he got this faraway, haunted look, and I knew he was reliving something. Reliving what though? Killing children, taking apart their small bodies, burying them in the walls. I shuddered, sickened. Was what, Dad? Giving in, he said finally, eyelids fluttering closed. He dropped his head in his hands. Giving in, I repeated. So, what, you just started stalking children? No, it was gradual. I started with animals. The pig, I said, color draining from my face as I remembered his first attempt to teach me butchery at age 7. No, long before that. I started with chickens. He sighed. I discovered that killing, any kind of killing, left me free for a while. But within a few months, the whispers would come back louder, and I'd have to escalate, like upping a dosage. He rubbed his eyes. Finally, I understood the strange, black moods that gripped your mother, brewing until she, don't you blame her? I growled, clenching my fists. What happened to her was tragic. Don't you dare pretend you're like her. Oh, said he. He shook his head. Of course I'm not like her. If I were, you'd be just another family secret, buried like your dead aunt, or like what Uncle Rudy did to that girl. Conveniently forgotten so your grandparents could pretend to have perfect families. Your dead mother was a pretty picture on your dresser, tragically passed from illness. They always said, but it wasn't like that when she was alive. She was funny, smart, charming, but also deeply, deeply difficult. Since you're asking for a confession, said he, the murders in our family didn't start with me. Everything began with her. My father met my mother at an event at the Chinese Culture Center, where both their families were occasionally involved. Neither my father nor my mother were much interested in the goings-on, and the pair of them escaped together to spend the evening walking and chatting, lost in each other's company. They fell very quickly in love and conceived me out of wedlock, much to the chagrin of both their families. They married to appease the older generations, but by all accounts, they were happy. Happy, that is, except for the shadow that descended over my mother. One night, my father told me, as she lay in bed beside him, her belly round and heavy with me, she asked him if he was superstitious. Did he believe in spirits, demons? What about the idea that twins could feel each other after death? No, he said, I don't believe in any of those things. Why are you asking? I bet, she said, with a strange and strained smile, you didn't know I had a twin sister. He didn't. In fact, he thought she was joking at first. He only confirmed the existence of her twin later, speaking with her grandmother, who admitted that the twin had drowned tragically at the age of 12 in the neighbor's swimming pool. The family was devastated. How she drowned in relatively shallow water, with a floating pool toy nearby, when by all accounts she was a skilled swimmer, was a mystery. It was also strange she'd been found alone, given the twins were usually inseparable. As for my mother, to have her twin ripped away from her at such a young age was like losing half her soul. She burst into tears whenever her sister's name was spoken to her. Yet, when she finally recovered, she blossomed like they'd never seen. And then she met my father. Dad, really? I said. He never spoke much of my mother when I was growing up. And though I knew she died young after a struggle with mental illness, this was the first I'd heard of a sibling. A twin? A twin you've never told me about, who you're implying she fucking drowned. Language, Sadie. I could have smacked him. I glared instead, enunciating each syllable. Bullshit. As his brow knit, I added, even if Mom had a sister, why would you assume there's some deep, dark secret here? You haven't told me anything that would imply it wasn't an accident. Mom probably wound up with postpartum psychosis because she had unprocessed grief from losing her twin. Not just hers, he said, his voice suddenly devoid of inflection. What? I blinked. When he did not explain, I demanded, what do you mean? Who else has a... I paused. blood running cold. Family secrets. His dark eyes leveled with mine. Dad, I said, heart quickening. Dad, who else has a? Check your birth certificate. You're lying. I would have known. He would have told me. Someone would have told me. This all had to be some elaborate concoction, warping our family history to shift blame. She didn't have postpartum psychosis, he said. I caught her just in time. To save you. Just you. You're lying. I don't know why I fought so hard to discredit this particular part of his account, especially when it could be so easily verified by a glance at my birth certificate, which I had at home. I suppose because it shattered the image, pre-children in the walls, that I'd had of our family. Like biting into a perfectly red and beautiful apple only to find that inside it's black and rotten. Everything I knew about my parents was a lie. Really was a carefully curated image. And while I'd already given up on having a good father, I didn't want to lose the ideal I held of my mother too. I couldn't actually remember her, of course. There were only photographs of a beautiful young woman with an angelic smile, always with a flower in her long, glossy hair. Growing up, I used to kiss her picture goodnight, entranced by the tale of a young woman dead of a tragic illness. I suppose I imagined that she would have been the perfect parent had she lived. My father, who raised me with enough loving kindness to almost match my imaginary version of my mother, never disillusioned me about her perfection. Until now. His lips pursed, head cocked at my denial. Then he said, "Excuse me." Turning away, he slammed his fist so hard into the table that I heard the crack of his knuckles as he broke them. I gasped, recoiling, as he hunched over his broken hand with his teeth clenched at the pain, eyes tearing, saliva and blood bubbling at his mouth. Then he sat up, cradling the broken hand, and said, "It was telling me to smash your face in." I breathed. Now then, the children. Why did I start killing children? That's what you really want to know. I didn't want to know. But the officers who were monitoring our discussion would be appalled if I abandoned the interview now, just as he was approaching the critical point. So I told him I needed a bathroom break. I fled and leaned over the bathroom sink, splashing cold water on my face from the faucet. I closed my eyes and put down my head, pretending for a few minutes that I was anywhere but here, interviewing my axe-murderer father about secrets I wished I'd never unearthed. Finally, I forced myself to look in the mirror, into the face that had my mother's high cheekbones and my father's narrow eyes. The pair of them really had been a picture-perfect couple. What other rot would I expose if I dug deeper? Finally, I marched back out to the interview room to face the monster in my father. "I nearly suffocated you when you were 5 years old," he said without preamble. What? I had no memory of this. You were asking me a question. Just some innocent question. You had thousands of questions in those days. And sudden rage seized me, and I just grabbed your face, cupped my hand over your nose and mouth, like this. He mimed the action, his broken hand cradling the back of an invisible head, and the other hand cupping over an imaginary mouth and nose. The voices. They were loud that day, deafening, like church bells. They kept telling me to squeeze, so I held while you flailed and turned purple until you went limp. His hand squeezed tighter. In spite of myself, I felt my heart pounding. Felt myself counting the seconds. He kept squeezing, not looking at me, but at some distant memory. And then, abruptly, he let go. I exhaled, not even realizing I'd been holding my breath until his eyes flickered up to me again. You woke up in just a couple of minutes. I don't remember any of this. Well, you were only 5 years old. He paused, and I comforted you right afterwards and told you that you'd had a bad dream. You lied to me, I said, accusing. He gave me a look. Yes, sweetie. I lied to you rather than explain to you that Daddy was possessed and purposefully suffocated you. I glowered and crossed my arms. Yeah, sure. Good call, I guess. Dad of the year. He actually laughed. Just a short little laugh, but it was the first spark I'd seen of the man I knew before he retreated into his shell again. I didn't trust myself with you after that, so I dropped you off with your grandparents. Then I tried to kill myself. A noose, a gun, sleeping pills. But it wouldn't let me go through with it. I finally understood what your mother went through. Went back to your grandparents and picked you up. Just like her, I was going to. Too. His voice cracked. He'd been numb telling me about the loss of my mother, but as he described his plans to end my life, emotion finally broke through. He put a hand over his mouth to hold in the sobs and said, "Because of how I choked you, I was expecting you to be afraid, ready to have to coax you, but..." He shook his head. "The moment I arrived, you just flew into my arms. You were so happy to see me. Daddy, Daddy. You said, so excited to be coming home with me, beaming and smiling. And I just..." He blinked quickly. I knew then that I was going to fight it. For a little while, just you were enough to keep away the darkness. He was crying now. I reached across, and he squeezed my hand, his fingers dirty and his nails crusted with blood. Then he let go, reached down and grabbed his shirt, pulled it up over his head. I gaped, shrinking back. He'd always been so proper, always in a button-down, and usually a tie. I'd never seen him shirtless, not even at the beach. His entire torso, front and back, was covered in crisscrossing scars, some deep, some shallow, some very fresh, but most quite old. Hearing me suck in a breath, he pulled his shirt back on. I did try to fight it in all kinds of ways, but he shrugged. It stopped working. And then, having finished the account of our family, he told me about how his own murders began. If you are here for all of the grisly specifics of each particular murder, which wall he tore open and which implements he used to take which bodies apart, you are in the wrong place. My goal isn't to titillate with a gruesome recounting, but to understand why. Why in the walls? Why specifically children? In any case, my father spared me the worst of the details. That part of his confession he saved for the police. But as to the matter of why, I must begin with Mary Lewis. Her murder was unplanned. The voices were particularly loud that day, he said of Mary. I really did mean to send her straight home. But she mentioned her mother was napping, how bored she was, so she came over. I realized no one was likely to notice her missing just yet. And, he rubbed his face, unable to look at me. I strangled her, hid her in the bushes behind the house until you were asleep, and then I, chopped her up and put her in the freezer. That's when you caught me, when I was cleaning. Did you black out? I interrupted, trying not to listen even as every detail burned into my mind. No, he admitted. No, it's more like a light switch turns off. A part of me just dims, while the voices turn up. Sometimes it's hard to know what is me and what isn't. The fact I can't distinguish, it makes it worse. This explanation didn't inspire much comfort. Once the part of him that was himself switched back on, and the voices dimmed down, he panicked. Her body couldn't remain forever in the freezer. Nor did he want to risk burying her in the yard and leaving freshly disturbed soil. But of course, my father was an architect. He was very, very good with compartments and compartmentalizing. As soon as I was back at school, he cleared out the closet under the stairs, walling it in so that the space was a foot shorter on the interior. A difference so subtle you couldn't even see it with the usual boxes and bins stored under there. What he didn't mention, but that I remember growing up, is he'd been genuinely fond of Mary. He kept drawings she'd made for him, and a little jar with feathers, and some pretty stones she'd collected. I believed it was genuine when he sent flowers and letters of condolence to the family. But at the same time as he appeared to mourn her, he stepped over her body every night going up and down that staircase, as did I, unwittingly. Eventually, the horror faded, he said. I realized I wasn't going to get caught. and I could almost pretend it was someone else who'd done it. For the first time, the very first time in years, I had quiet. He closed his eyes and lifted his face toward the ceiling. The absolute perfection of that quiet. You have no idea, said he, how blessed that quiet was. I didn't speak. His eyelids fluttered open, and he returned his gaze to me. Afterward, when the voices came back, I started to plan the murders. Whenever the voices got loud, the rest I think you can put together. I sat there, perfectly still. Now that he'd stopped talking, it hit me all at once. Horror at the nature of his crimes. Horror at the reason behind them. I couldn't process it all. Not right then. There, in that room. And finally I said, I need to go. I need to go. Sadie. He called after me as I stood up. I looked back, sure that he was going to once again apologize, that he was going to tell me he loved me, that he was going to say he'd tried, and he was so sorry, and beg my forgiveness. But he didn't say any of that. He was smiling, and he said, with the most terrifying expression of anticipation that I have ever seen, I was saving you for last. I gasped and fled. Despite his attorney's insistence on a mental health evaluation, my father was declared competent by the courts. He entered a guilty plea and seemed unsurprised, relieved even when he was issued a death sentence. His time on death row was mostly spent in isolation. I was permitted occasional visits, but during these brief breaks from his solitude, we conversed very little. He'd ask how I was doing, trying to make sure I was keeping my grades up as I entered college, but then he'd go quiet. The rest of the time would just be the two of us sitting in silence, while he bowed his head, slumped against the table. On my last visit, my father asked me if I believed his account. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't in the habit of lying, and he almost always saw through me anyway. I just looked at him sadly. Finally, I said, I don't know, Dad. Am I just a monster? Are you? I wondered. He sighed and already seeing someone. Did he think I wasn't? After all of this, he rubbed his eyes. He seemed very tired. Finally, he said, you know, Sadie, through everything your mother went through, and now me, the doctors told me demons can't be real. That if there were ghouls, demons, spirits, ghosts, there'd be evidence. But murderers, child abusers, delusional psychopaths, serial killers, these are all real, and so I must be one of these evil men. But, he sighed, it seems such hubris to think that if we haven't scientifically proven something that means it isn't real. I mean, supposing there were things beyond our understanding, things like I've told you. What do you think would happen when someone who's got what I've got told the world? No one would ever believe them. And do you know, Sadie, my love, that's the worst part. That's the worst part. He put his head in his hands. It always distressed him very much when I didn't believe him. Dad, I sighed. What is it you want? Redemption, forgiveness. It's not like I could give him those things. You still don't understand, he burst. You think this is about evil. This thing in me. It didn't want those children. Then why the fuck did you kill them? Dad, if it didn't make you do it, then why? What does it want? The same thing, he sobbed, that I've wanted for years and years and years. As he spoke for the first time in my entire life, I felt a chill in his presence. A chill that started at my nape and trickled down my spine like ice water. Deep, gut clenching, heart racing, fear, every instinct screamed. I leaned back, and that's what saved my life when he lunged, howling, you. I fell over backwards, scrambling away while the guards rushed to restrain him. He writhed, screaming at me, spittle flecking his lips. Get back here. Bitch. Fucking bitch. You're a terrible daughter. Get back here, right now. He spewed invective, words that no man should say about his own daughter. In my last look at him, It almost appeared as if he was tearing himself apart, blood running down his face from where his hands tried to restrain his mouth. His fingers jabbed into his eyes, blinding him so that he couldn't see me, so that when he shook the guards off, burly though they were, he groped sightlessly for me. I shrank against the wall as he just barely missed my foot, blood streaming from his eyes like tears until the guards caught hold of him again, and I fled. Victor Chen never completed his sentence. Nobody likes a child molester, which he wasn't, but that was the prevailing assumption given the ages of his victims. He was found beaten to a pulp and his throat slit. Probably the guards looked the other way and let it happen. To be honest, I think it was a mercy for him. His long ordeal was finally over. But I do think often about what he said at the end. If hauntings are confined only to the experiences of the haunted, how can we ever know? How can we tell the difference between a haunted man and a madman? I'm not sure you can. Certainly the courts and doctors couldn't. But whether it was real or not, I finally understand what he meant when he said it didn't want those children. I should have figured it out sooner, simply based on what he told me of my mother. First, she killed her twin sister, then her own child, my twin, and very nearly me, all those she loved. As for why she never tried to kill my father, well, I think it's because she did something much worse, cursing him with the most terrible fate of all. It was in her final words, the ones he mumbled so I couldn't make them out at first. Her last words to him were, "I'm sorry. It wouldn't let me die without someone new." Which brings us to my father's turn as host. All the children he killed. The ages ranged from 8 to 18. The last one had recently celebrated her 18th birthday, just as I'd been about to. They were nearly always, in fact, girls my own age. You see, this is what he meant when he said it didn't want them. It wants what you love. It wouldn't let him die. It wouldn't let him rest. But while he succumbed to its evil in every other sense, committing the most terrible of acts and becoming a quite literal monster, still, sometimes I think about the fact that, in the end, he managed never to give it what it really wanted. That in his own warped way, he continued protecting me. Because every one of my father's victims was really just a stand-in, like stabbing a doll instead of the real thing. Each murder just a substitute for me. I'd like to think he won. That he prevented it from getting what it wanted or passing on to anybody else. That even though he couldn't kill himself, it lost when his throat was slit, eliminating both him and it from the world. But a couple weeks ago, I saw in the newspaper that a pastor from one of the local churches, a progressive-minded, good-hearted woman known for making prison visits and helping the most unfortunate in society, had been arrested for the abuse and murder of two elderly left in her care. When asked why she'd committed such a crime, this woman, who for decades had served the community with kindness and charity, who by all accounts loved her clients very dearly, covered her face and said, with apparent confusion, a phrase that gave me chills in its terrible, intimate familiarity. I had to. One late summer day, my old Uncle Greg called to tell me his sister had suffered from cardiac arrest. The news of my aunt's passing would send me off on a cross-country road trip while my wife stayed home to look after the dog and cats. Sarah protested at first, saying she wanted to be there for emotional support. But this wasn't my first funeral procession, and truth be told, I was never close to my aunt. I was just going to be there for Greg. So after convincing Sarah to just stay home and spend the week relaxing, I was off on my road trip. Little did I know what I'd be getting into. My first day cruising the interstate went off without a hitch. Despite the sullen nature of the journey, getting out and seeing the open countryside of multiple different states made my spirit feel lightweight and free of life's day-to-day grind. I'd end the first day by pulling into a cozy little town, stopping at a small mom-and-pop diner before checking in at a nearby motel. Day 2 seemed a little more hectic. Waking up late, I rushed out of the hotel and hit the road. Opting to skip breakfast entirely, I spent the better half of 8 hours driving 10 over the speed limit, stopping only to get gas. Sleeping in had put me 4 hours behind schedule, and come nightfall, I found myself on a long stretch of highway snaking through mountainous woodlands. My eyes drifted between the road and the digital clock on the dashboard. After 12 straight hours of driving, I was cursing under my breath and looking for NWOEAR to stop for the night. When the woods surrounding the highway became so thick that it began to block out the natural moonlight, I sighed and came to the conclusion I might be pulling over to sleep in my car. To my surprise, a sign popped up, indicating an exit for a town. Twinas Grove, population 700. All the tension left my body, and in an instant I became more relaxed. The exit took me down a winding canyon road, made unnerving by the lack of guardrails and low-hanging tree branches that seemed to reach out for my windshield. Finally, it dumped off into a flat forested area, which I thought vacant at first. After a moment of driving, I noticed the houses buried deep in the tree line. The driveways leading to the houses were gravel and well hidden between the trees. From what I could make out with the brief passing of my car's headlights, the houses appeared quite old, weathered and worn down. One sat closer to the road, and I could clearly see the doors and windows boarded up. I had been driving through this town for all but 5 minutes, and already it was creeping me out. Just when I began to consider turning around, the dull glow of a gas station appeared in the distance. Knowing I'd need to fuel up to reach the next major town, I decided to pull in alongside one of the pumps. Figured I'd ask the clerk inside if there were any places I could stay for the night while I was there. I stepped out of my car, embracing the unusually cold air, which sent shivers down my spine. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my wallet only to realize the pumps were so old that they didn't take any form of card payment. Shrugging it off, I walked into the store, only to find it empty. Literally empty. The entire building was just an open room, no shelves or freezers for storing goods. A gross checkered tile with numerous stains and cracks dominated the room, accentuated by a flickering light in the back right corner. I stared at the surreal and vacant store in front of me, only snapping back to reality when I saw a roach scurrying across the floor. Feeling thoroughly unnerved by the situation, I returned to my car and contemplated my next move. It was damn near midnight now, and I needed to get some shut-eye. Against my better judgment, I pulled out of the parking lot and headed further up the road. Not even a mile up the road, an old wooden sign came up for a roadside inn. With crossed fingers, I pulled into the lot. My headlights illuminated a 2-story log cabin-style cottage nestled between thickets of trees. Moss or ivy appeared to be growing on the outer walls, and all of the windows were dark except for one, which had a faint glow. An uneasy feeling washed over me once I turned the car off. I spent another minute debating if I really wanted to approach that building, which didn't have a single source of light besides the faint glow from the first-floor window. Stepping out into the night air, it immediately struck me how eerily silent my surroundings seemed to be. After many camping trips in the mountains and forests, I had grown accustomed to the nocturnal sounds of the wilderness. Owls, crickets, the call of coyotes or foxes. The area around this cabin was dead quiet. Not even the slightest rustling of trees or bushes could be heard. Listening to my own footsteps while approaching the inn made the very hairs on my back stand up. The door to the cabin had an old rusting metal sign which read "Open" nailed above the door handle. I spent another few seconds just staring at the sign, wondering if I should knock or just step inside. Out of nowhere, a rush of hot air ran down my neck with a distinct sensation which can only be described as someone standing right behind me and letting out a deep breath. I spun around, heart now racing from what I just felt, but nobody was there. Chalking it up to a lack of sleep, I turned around and nearly screamed when the face of an old man stood just inches away. He somehow managed to open the door and positioned himself in the doorway without making even the slightest sound. The man wore brown dress pants and a brown tweed jacket. Wrinkles lined his scowling face, which sat under a messy mop of scraggly gray hair. "What are ye doing out this time of night?" His voice barked in the silence of the night, filled with rasp and old age. Holding my still beating heart, I drew in a deep breath and closed my eyes, looking for a place to stay for the night, sir. His eyes narrowed, nearly hiding his hazy green irises. After turning and grumbling, the old man gestured me to follow him inside. Only one vacant room, top floor. It's $50 a night. We walked into a dim lobby, lit by candles and decorated with antiques from a bygone time. The old man stepped behind a counter which held various dusty books and old glass bottles. I pulled out my wallet and offered him my card. He took it, shaking his head and letting out a sigh. "Only take cash, son. But I tell you what, you can stay for tonight and pay me back later." He handed my card back and reached down under the desk to grab an old brass key. A grateful smile fell upon my face. "Man, I can't thank you enough." Before I could finish, he cut me off. No need to thank me. It's been a good while since I've had a guest come to stay." He paused, leaned in, and displayed a crooked smile. "I'm happy to accommodate you, son. Take a candle here to light your way." Standing there somewhat speechless, I grabbed the key from him along with one of the candles. I looked down and saw the room number etched into the face of the key. Room 13. The old man continued to show his unflattering smile as I nodded my head and turned to the hallway. Against the dim glow of candlelight, I saw a row of vintage photographs lining the wall. The people in them were dressed from the Victorian era. Walking down the old creaking floorboards, I saw the hallway split into two paths. On the right was the staircase to the second floor. To the left sat the intersection of another hallway, with the vague outline of a deer head mounted on the wall. I stared at that mounted head as I approached the staircase, unnerved by the frightened expression it wore on its frozen dead face. Just when I began to climb the flight of stairs, I saw that fucking deer head move in the peripheral of my vision. Frozen on the steps, I slowly turned around and peeked over the low wall which separated the hallway divide. The deer head looked straight on down the hall, a vacant stare in its beady eyes. "Okay, I'm really fucking tired. I need to get some sleep," I whispered. Making my way to the top of the staircase, I tiptoed through the halls looking for room 13, all while keeping my head on a swivel. My room ended up being at the very back of the hallway. Slotting the key into the doorknob, I stopped and turned around when I heard something behind me. It sounded like a group of people whispering something unintelligible, just out of earshot. But there wasn't anything there in the hallway behind me, just those vintage photographs sitting above burgundy carpets on brown floral wallpaper. Shaking my head, I quickly unlocked the door and pushed my way inside. The room I stepped into seemed cramped. A double bed with a wooden frame sat against the wall, facing a lone window which revealed only tree branches on the other side. Two end tables accompanied the bed on each side, with a small attached bathroom at the foot of the bed. That was the extent of the room, but I didn't spend any time thinking or complaining about the dimensions. Setting the candle down on the end table, I tucked myself in and closed my eyes. Sleep did not come. Almost in an act of defiance, the room became unsettling and noisy the moment I closed my eyes. Branches hit the wall outside the window. Creaks from the floorboards echoed beyond the closed door, and a faint scratching sound emanated from the bathroom. Completely frustrated, I got up to investigate the scratching sound, but found nothing. The sound disappeared the moment I stepped foot into the bathroom, only to flare up again when I laid back down. Soon, even the sound of the candle became unbearable, keeping me awake with the crackling and burning wick. In a fit of irrational thinking, I blew out the candle and tucked my head between two pillows. A cold chill then swept over me, and I opened my eyes. That's when I saw it. Perched on the ceiling, obscured by shadows of the night, was a distorted human face. Frozen in fear, I sat there and watched this face as it slowly moved across the ceiling, shifting its facial expressions in horrifying and inhuman ways. The thing looked like it was in constant agony. Once it hovered directly above me, I heard faint whispering coming from its mouth, The very same whispering I heard in the hallway earlier. Ice ran through my veins when this shadowy face began to descend from the ceiling, heading right for me. Taking control of my body, I let out a piercing scream and jolted out of bed. Crashing through the door, I ran down the hallway. Time slowed as my heart blasted in my chest. Hundreds of those faces began materializing in the very walls, slowly floating out in my direction. No, 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 no. It can't be real. My screams only seemed to anger the shadow entities, which now lunged out of the walls with glowing red eyes. Making a sharp turn, I bolted down the staircase, my feet crashing down loudly with each step. When I reached the bottom, I froze in horror. Blocking the hallway ahead stood a shadow figure 10 feet tall. It had a rotting deer skull for a head with piercing red eyes. Horrible demonic whispering radiated from the creature as it lurched forward. Booking it back up the staircase, I ran down the hallway opposite of room 13 until I hit a dead end with a single window. Turning to see that fucking Wendigo-esque beast hot on my trail, I made the decision to jump out of the fucking window. I landed hard into a thick blanket of bushes below, twisting my ankle in the process. Quickly getting to my feet, I hopped out of the bushes and looked up at the window. A pair of red eyes locked with mine, no body to be seen. The eyes slowly backed off and disappeared into the darkness. Frantic, I ran through the thick foliage and back into the parking lot, where I thanked God to see and sit in my car. I booked it out of that town and drove all night back up the highway until sunrise. Greg said I looked like mulled over shit when I arrived for the funeral, and I wasn't able to offer the emotional support I wanted to give him. I took a different route entirely on the way back home, never even wanting to see the sign for that God-forsaken town again. The thing that bothers me, though, is that when I go back to look on Google Maps, Twinisgrove isn't there. Doesn't even show up on old paper maps. Where the fuck did I go that night? She did not wake crying, screaming, or flailing against sweat-soaked sheets as she had done for the last 353 mornings. Her body felt rested, charged with an unexpected energy. She sat up in bed, eyes coming into focus, and wondered whether this day would mark the transition others had told her would come, whether moving on was something a mother should ever allow herself to do. In the next room, on the couch where he had woken the last 336 days, he shifted his body and coughed into his pillow, the strain cracking the crusted tears on his cheeks. His stirring no longer troubled her. Another transition, she thought as her legs freed themselves from the dry bedding. Time to get up. She pushed the words toward him, past her lips, waking her voice. Of the 47 plastic hangers that lightly swayed along the iron rod on her side of the closet, only 12 actually held clothes. Most she had given away, too stained by maternal memories. Ironically, directly before her still hung the civilian shirt their son wore the weekend before his deployment, a beige short-sleeve polo with a burgundy collar. She looked past it and pulled down one of her long-sleeved shirts that remained on the shelf above, and a worn pair of blue capris from the shelf below. He lumbered past her into the bathroom, then past her again as he left, wordless but indifferent to her presence, as had been his custom these past 11 months. Yet, as they dressed, he watched her, almost reluctantly, and considered whether loving her again was something he should ever allow himself to do. Words between them had grown stale and terse. Today's the day. She waited, but he provided no response. Are you ready? I'm still getting dressed, so no, he murmured, his lean body sagging on the corner of the bed. No, I mean. Excited. At least somewhat happy about this. That we're buying that little house you picked out for us on top of a mountain. Maybe. Can we not talk about it right now? I just woke up. She did not answer but walked toward the bed, unfolded a pair of ankle socks, and sat down on the opposite corner. He stood quickly and stepped toward the dresser, allowing his hands to find their own way through the drawers. Her left sock snagged a toenail, causing her to wince. She stopped to look at him, letting the sock dangle from her foot. He had aged 10 years in the last several months, noticeable mostly around his eyes and mouth. Perhaps so had she, but neither carped at the other. Where before she had suffered with him, now, but only within the last few minutes, she found herself beyond him, pitying him. I must save him from himself. The unexpected energy surge. Where is the picture? He grumbled. He would have wanted this, for us to be happy. I did this for him as much as I did it for us. It will be wonderful, there at the top of the world, surrounded. He turned on her, shouting, "Where is the picture?" "In my top drawer." The energy emboldened her, but she spoke softly. "I can't keep looking at him every moment I'm in this room. Not anymore. Starting today." He opened the drawer and looked longingly at the 5x7 framed photograph of their son, then closed the drawer. When the sock slipped past her toenail, she dropped her foot to the floor and stared at the top of the dresser. "It's time. He's dead, but I won't be," she told herself, and walked into the kitchen. Eventually he joined her, moving his legs slowly, grudgingly, toward the small kitchen table their son had made for them 2 years ago for their anniversary. But he watched her in his peripheral vision as she stood at the stove, smiling and whispering things to herself. "I'm having eggs. Do you want eggs?" "I'll eat them," he answered. She turned and took slow steps toward him until her body almost touched his. He did not move but stared vacuously into the shadow he cast on the tabletop. She reached around him and gently pushed her groin against his, hoping to feel in him a semblance of the now unmistakable energy within her. But there was nothing. She moved her face toward his, but he pulled away and reached for the back of the chair. "Sit down then, and I'll make you some." As she cooked, she talked about their new little house, offering ideas she had borrowed from websites and magazines on how they might make it their own. He offered nothing in return but the occasional nod and indifferent grunt. They finished breakfast quickly, but noiselessly she, in a rapid succession of small bites, each a step closer to commencing the day's journey, he, in large gulps, to be done with it. She looked at her watch. It would take them almost 2 hours to reach the realtor. Another 30 minutes from there to reach the little house. The signing was at noon. "We could have a late lunch in that little village at the foothills before we drive up the mountain," she thought hopefully. By mid-morning, when they pulled out of the driveway, she considered the picture in her underwear drawer and convinced herself that, when they returned, it would need to lose itself among the others she had already packed away. He woke to find himself standing in bed, his mouth in the shape of a scream that would not leave his throat, his right fist clenched, his left hand shaking at his side. A soft light streamed through the window, revealing the room, and slowly reminding him where he was. She lay between his legs, still asleep, cocooned in a blanket she had bought from a local vendor during an art festival at the foot of the mountain the day before. When his hands relaxed and the sound of the scream in his head finally dissipated, he stepped to the floor and tread warily toward the window, in consideration not of her but of the dream that woke him, in which the world outside was burning, leaving only him to inherit the ash. Yet what lingered as the details quickly vanished from his mind was the body of his son, lying in a scorched field, his eyes wide but staring blindly toward a blood-red sky. A vast mountainscape sprawled on the other side of the white glass, almost daring him to find peace in its timeless sublimity. But he merely coughed, scratched his groin, and turned back toward her side of the bed. The blanket's pattern was allegedly inspired by a myth originating with an indigenous tribe to which the attractive middle-aged vendor belonged, but he had forgotten the story and now found the array of colors distracting. "Get up," he growled. "Sun's up." "I'm up, so you're up." He dressed and ate without her, compelled to continue the project he had started a week after they moved into the small A-frame cabin skirted by 10 tree-infested acres. "I'm heading out. On the trail," he shouted from the front door. She stirred but returned to her dream that did not involve their son. Only 12 large flagstone steps separated their front porch from the forest edge. It was August, and since the last box was unpacked in June, he had driven away a family of raccoons, several shrews, and 3 elks, but nothing yet to deter him from further forging his trail between the trees. Light had only just reached the mountain, but could not yet pierce the dense canopies above him. Armed with a machete and a rake, he cut through thick, interwoven vines and other undergrowth to reveal a narrow path across the forest floor. But his progress was often hindered by summer heat and moments of unwanted reflection that forced him to sit on the exposed earth and either rest or weep. The trail was not her idea. He needed something that was his own, that would permit him long periods of isolation during the day, that would ultimately heal the purulent wound that had forged its own path through his soul for the last year. He would start with a 2-mile loop trail from which more sinuous trails could eventually be branched. The longer he stared into the depths of the forest, the more the path revealed itself. At noon, he brushed off the clinging dirt, weeds, and insects and walked the new clearing back toward the house. When he entered, the fresh smell of cedar surprisingly overwhelmed and invigorated him. It took some time for his eyes to adjust to the lack of light, so he listened for her. The house was cold and quiet. He made his way toward the folding panoramic doors, through which he saw her sitting on the back porch, facing the mountainscape. "Hi, I still can't get over the fact that this view is ours. How does the trail look? I'm hungry. I'm gonna eat some lunch and keep working on it." His voice sounded more fatigued than it was. She wanted to offer her help but knew better. This is his project. He needs it. She left her view and followed him inside. "I know. After lunch, how about we drive down to the village? We could shop some of the antique stores, get some things for the gardens and the house, then maybe head into town from there and see a movie." He spread the hummus onto the pita bread and licked the spoon. "Maybe you can go into town today without me. I'm not at a good stopping place on the trail. We could do a movie this Friday if you still want." He tried but failed to find an encouraging tone. He did not want her there. "All right, I'll pick up some things for dinner tonight, if you're willing to grill." "Yeah," he sighed. "Just no beef, though. You're the chef." She reached past him and pulled a tomato from the crisper. The mountains and the cool morning breeze had made her particularly buoyant, and this vexed him. He ate in silence, staring at his plate as she recounted every thought about the house, her gardens, their lives together there that the mountains inspired since she had woken. When he finished, he held his plate and waited for an ample pause between sentences. "I'm heading back out. Are you about to leave?" She looked at him, nonplussed by the interruption. "I think so. I'll just make a short list for the store, and I may visit that one antique place with the statue out front, the one we went to when we first moved here, remember? Maybe after that I can stop by that little bookstore next to it and pick out something for us to read." "Fine." He pushed the word through. "Something scary, maybe, or a mystery." He shrugged and turned toward the door as she searched for a pen and paper. The sun was now higher in the sky and had warmed the air considerably since noon, but he walked to the edge of the forest and waited in the shade of the outermost tree, unseen, for several minutes until the car had fully made its way down the steep gravel driveway. At that point, he walked east along the curved forest's edge until he reached his shed. Sunlight burned into the back of his neck as he hesitated before the door. The key was in his hand, but he first had to block out the unrelenting images of his son lying in a field, surrounded by a world on fire, with his wife standing there, proudly straddling his body, dressed in fatigues, waving a small flag with one hand and saluting their lifeless son with the other. Her garden shed beneath the back deck contained mostly her tools and assorted bags of fertilizers. His was several yards from the side of the house and stored a few containers of their winter clothes, but mostly his larger outdoor tools. Only he had the key to this shed. He turned on the light, plugged in the table saw, and cut another set of boards from the pile of assorted wood left behind by the previous owner. Meticulously, he continued the project he had begun on their second week in the house, the project he hid from her within the locked shed. He nailed the last board and moved back to admire his handiwork, then stepped over the side and lay within the rectangular box. The dimensions were accurate. It only lacked a lid, the wood for which he would need to buy on a carefully planned trip to town. He sat up and wondered whether to stain it or merely apply polyurethane. No need for padded lining. He chuckled, amused by the thought of a corpse needing comfort. The unfinished coffin fit neatly and undetectably between the wall and the winter storage boxes, but he covered it with worn blankets nonetheless. Having one project near completion galvanized his commitment to the other, so he walked toward the trailhead with renewed purpose and swung violently against resisting vines and weeds, cutting more deeply into the forest than he knew. Thunder woke her. Her book lay open on her chest, beneath her hands, and her lamplight was still on. His light was off, but his side of the bed was empty. The book she had bought him lay closed on his nightstand. It took some time for her eyes to adjust to the darkness beyond, so she listened for him. The house was warm and quiet. She thought to call out, but instead placed her socked feet on the floor and shambled nervously toward the window. A small light emanated from within the forest. There was no sound of rain, but it was only a matter of time. She dressed, pulled the flashlight from her nightstand, and inched her way through the maze of furniture until she reached the front door. Another peal of thunder and a thread of lightning hurried her along the flagstones and onto the trail, which was wide and smooth, devoid of unwieldy vegetation. Nonetheless, she walked slowly, listening between steps for his sounds. She found him on his knees, still in his pajamas. The handle of the mashie rested against his open left hand. Hanging on the stub of a newly cut branch was the lantern, which revealed his bowed, trembling frame. When she touched his back, his body became still. At the next peal of thunder, he stood up, grabbed the lantern, and walked past her toward the house. She stood and watched him move beyond the flickering beam of the flashlight before casting it into the darkness behind her. The trail ended where she stood, where he had been kneeling, but the light revealed no reason for his being there in the middle of the night, so she turned it toward the ground and made her way through what now seemed an ever-diminishing tunnel of trees. The rain made its way through the branches by the time she reached trail's entrance, and her cardigan was soaked by the time she reached the front door. All the lights in the house were on, but he was face down on the bed, the mashie still in his left hand. After turning off all but his lamplight, she took the mashie and slid it under her side of the bed. Morning light flooded through the window. For longer than she anticipated, she lay there with eyes closed, comforted by the lingering energy that let her smile despite the ordeal from a few hours before. Their new home amid the mountains was transforming her, moving her further away from the memories that had sought to hold her responsible. The rain had stopped, but he and the mashie were no longer in the house. He remembered that the antique store was in the same lot as the hardware store, which sold plywood. The dimensions he needed were on a scrap of paper in his pocket, and he had placed a heavy blanket in the bed of the truck days before in anticipation. She agreed to begin antiquing without him, while he bought another mashie from next door. Fortunately, the older of the only two associates there measured and cut the plywood quickly, giving him time to return to the truck to cover the lid and stow the mashie before she became suspicious. Afterward, they lunched at an outdoor cafe. He thought only of finishing the coffin as she talked at length about the history the antique dealer had told her behind the mid-century wrought iron chairs she bought for the deck. Yet each time he looked at her face, he could not suppress his growing hatred for her. She wanted him to serve, even used her connections to secure his deployment. She killed him. My God, she killed him. His left hand tightened, as though gripping the handle of the new mashie that lay sheathed beneath the driver's seat. "Let's get back," he interrupted. "I have a new idea for the trail, and I won't sleep well tonight without getting some of it done. You drive, though." He felt energized, but his eyes were bleary. As she drove and talked to him of ideas for the chairs, he sat in the passenger seat with eyes closed and leaned against the door, no longer pretending to listen, but watching as his mind previewed remnants of the nightmare that now seemed to haunt him both night and day, where she saluted their son as his body burned to ashes that blew away before he could cup them in his hands. He opened his eyes only when he felt the truck ascend their long gravel driveway, but the blurred shape just beyond his window, at the edge of the forest, startled him. Initially, he dismissed the peripheral movement as a shadowed deer responding to the sound of the truck, but it appeared again as she made the last turn. "Stop. What is it? Did you fall asleep?" She laughed as she pressed the brake. Only the head was now visible from behind the thick pine, but it was clearly their son. "Do you see something?" she asked. He stared hard at the face, hoping for a response, but it merely dissolved into the woodland. "No, I was dreaming. Woke up too quickly. Just keep driving." She laughed again and drove the truck into the space next to her car. As soon as she turned off the engine, he got out and pulled both chairs from the bed, making sure not to disturb the blanket. He placed them on the front porch, returned to retrieve the new mesh sheet, and walked straight toward the trail. The trees began to smell of autumn and teased with red and yellow leaves, which somehow strengthened his swing. For more than an hour he pushed his path in new directions, but always forward. With each step on raw, exposed earth, the haunting images of his son faded, yet his momentum only intensified. His breathing was steady and his body felt young, but at the second hour a sharp pain pulsed through his left arm and the mesh sheet flew from his hand, stabbing the untouched vegetation ahead. He rubbed out the cramp and walked toward the handle that emerged through the reaching vines and weeds. It was only when he pulled it from the ground that he saw the broad patch of flesh beneath the braided vines. He knelt to touch it and recoiled at the warm softness of human skin. Pulling back allowed him perspective. It was too small to be a body, but certainly part of one. The vines were too enmeshed to reveal its shape, so he knelt again and used the machete to carve a circle around it. What lay there once the severed growth had been pulled away neither horrified nor disgusted him. Rather, with a most delicate touch, he ran his fingers along the detached leg starting at the heel, over the bulging calf and thigh, to what he expected would be a bloody hole full of mauled bone and muscles, but was instead clean, scarless tissue that stretched across the end. He overturned the leg and moved his whole hand slowly toward the toes, feeling for brokenness, but finding none. When he reached the ankle, he pulled away his hand and gasped at the small fused letters A and V, his son's first tattoo. Everything around him darkened and blurred. He gently lifted the leg closer to his face to smell the skin, to search for childhood scars, and then to hold it tightly against his chest. Vines, leaves, and weeds seemed to cover everything before him. Holding the leg in his left hand, he crawled through the uncut vegetation, using his right to feel for the other leg, an arm, any other part of his son that this forest had hidden. She did this. She sent him there to die, but they sent her his dead body without telling me, and she scattered him here. Despite another hour's search, he found nothing more of his son than what he held. Showing or telling her about his discovery was not an option, yet neither was leaving it in the forest, so he lovingly wrapped the leg in his jacket, carried it to the entrance of the trail, and walked quickly to his shed. He set the leg on one of the storage boxes and reached down to remove the blankets. A strong smell of pine filled the space. Beneath the small light, the leg appeared even fresher than before and felt warm, as though blood continued to circulate. It was the left leg, so he placed it upright in what would be the bottom right corner of the coffin and restored the blankets. The plywood was still in the bed of his truck. The lid would now need to be his priority. Tiredness set in, so he hung the machete by the door, turned off the light, and locked the shed behind him. She was where he expected to find her, sitting in one of the wrought iron chairs he had moved to the back deck, facing the mountains, but her arms hung to her side. The stem of an empty wine glass rested precariously between the fingers of her left hand, while the novel lay just beyond the reach of her right. From behind, she appeared asleep, for which he was grateful. He needed more time to compose himself. Yet the way her body slumped in the chair was peculiar enough to compel him to approach, but slowly. Her head was slightly tilted, her eyes were closed, and her mouth yawned wide and slanted. He watched her chest rise and fall, but then noticed something wrong about how the garage blanket covered her lower half. Without any regard for waking her, he threw back the blanket and saw what he did not expect to see. Her entire left leg was gone. He woke the next morning, slumped in the chair adjacent to her side of the bed, where she remained alive but unconscious. He sat up and stared blindly into the awful pattern of her blanket, trying to recall the details from the day before. There had been no blood, and much like the leg he found on the trail, the skin that covered her lower buttock was unblemished. When he had carried her from the deck to the bedroom, her body limp in his arms, she had no fever, and her breathing was stable. After he had removed her clothes, he decided to keep her undressed so he could examine her on occasion, but covered by the blanket, so he would not have to see her naked. He rose from the chair and kneeled by the side of the bed to wash her face. Once her mouth moved quickly, as though forming words she could not speak aloud, but then it relaxed. He lifted her lids and stared into her vacant eyes, but they would not stay open on their own. A small part of him wondered whether he should stay by her side, perhaps drive her down the mountain and find a hospital. But a more cogent part of him thought of the leg in the shed and the underwood that still hid the remnants of his precious boy. So he left her drooling onto the pillow, her mouth fluttering, and turned off the light behind him. He remembered leaving the mesh sheet in the shed, which reminded him of the plywood that was still covered by the blanket in the bed of his truck. Lid then trail, he decided, giving no more thought to her. The plywood became unwieldy as he carried it slowly toward the shed, which felt farther away than it was. Several times he was forced to drop it and reposition his hands, and each time, before lifting it again, he peered through the trees for segments of flesh. He traced the rectangle onto the plywood with a pencil and made swift, straight cuts with the saw. He then pulled away the blanket, revealing the leg, which appeared ruddier than before, and laid the board flush against the open box. When the last hinge was firmly attached, he gently opened it and thought he saw the large toe twitch. He closed the lid and quickly covered it with the blanket. Light and shadow, that's all. Yet he backed his way out of the shed noiselessly, eyes fixed upon every fold of the coffin-shaped blanket, reaching back for the machete and her old canvas sea bag before turning off the light and locking the door. When he turned, the house was on his left, immersed in mid-morning sun, but he readily succumbed to the gravitational pull of the trailhead to his right and soon found himself on his knees, deep within the foliage just beyond the area he last searched. Despite the softness of both the vegetation and the soil beneath, his hands began to numb and his thoughts drifted. The first image was of her amputated and naked beneath the gaudy blanket, but this quickly faded to a deeper memory of himself sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through a stack of bills as she and their son played on the living room floor with an assortment of small plastic jets, tanks, and armed soldiers, battle-posed in intricately painted camouflage fatigues that were uncannily similar to her own. Their mimicked rattles and booms bridged to a scene from his last nightmare, where their son aimed his gun-shaped hand at a tank that not only fired 3 missiles through his chest, but subsequently flattened his eviscerated body beneath its track. As the tank passed, she rose from its hatch and saluted the pulped corpse of her sole progeny, burning amid the weeds. This image dissolved when his hand brushed against the fingertips of another. He tore away the thin interlacing vines that enclosed the hand, seized it, and pulled the rest of the arm from the earth that had partially buried it. So overwhelmed by this discovery, he collapsed for a moment and succumbed to a maniacal laughter that continued to echo through the trees, even after he stopped. Like the leg, the shoulder was smooth and unblemished, and coiled around the index finger was the tattooed black band that commemorated the day of his enlistment. He set the right arm atop 2 low, short branches of the nearest tree and resumed his search, one hand raping the forest floor with the machete, the other probing every curvature, until, just 3 yards north of the tree, he gripped an ankle. She was on her side, the energy all but gone. For half an hour, she stared into the pillow, focusing only on stabilizing the erratic breathing that had woken her. She felt a dampness beneath her face and a dull ache in her jaw, but every effort to turn her head failed. Even her body would not respond to her will to rise from the bed. Only the index finger of her left hand could slightly move, but beyond her control. When she reclaimed the rhythm of her breathing, she called out to him hoarsely, believing that he must have brought her from the deck to the house, and that he must be near but merely unaware of her conscious state. She listened but heard only the oscillating fan in the corner behind her. She waited, called again, and listened, but nothing else in the house moved. Speaking aloud gave her strength, and she found herself able to flex the other 4 fingers. Soon she could move her wrist, and thereafter bend her arm, which allowed her to push against the mattress until she fell on her back. She strained her head forward, and could see that the blanket she had taken with her to the deck now covered her up to the neck, but she could see nothing beyond her large shrouded breasts. Her left arm, limp by her side, began to itch, so she moved it inward to rub against her thigh, but at once remembered the cause of her sudden unconsciousness on the deck and allowed the fitted sheet to relieve the irritation instead. Then the thought of her missing leg consumed her. Why is this happening? Where is he? Why did he leave me here this way? She screamed his name successively, each time her voice becoming clearer, stronger, yet still he did not respond. Determined not to succumb to helplessness, she reached over and whisked the blanket from her numbed body to examine the smooth, bloodless wound that remained. For a moment, she noted part of the blanket's pattern reveal itself as one corner folded in the air. 3 beige spirals arched above a female stick figure, holding in each hand 1/2 of a broken spear. In that moment, she also tried to recall what the woman had told her about the blanket's cultural significance, but when it fell to the floor, she saw what she did not expect to see. Both legs and her right arm were gone, replaced by the same partial stub of skin. She stared into and then beyond the non-existent space and began to scream, not a cry for her husband, but an excruciating wail that might be heard from a mother who witnesses the violent death of her child. She screamed until she could no longer hear herself, until the image of her disemboweled son disappeared, until her eyes opened to find her husband standing in the doorway, the mashite in his hand. Then everything faded to black. By noon it stopped raining, and though an oppressive humidity permeated the forest, he worked tirelessly, emboldened by the image of the 3 limbs symmetrically placed within the coffin. He was now hungry, having no appetite for breakfast, but he felt closer to finding more pieces of his son and dismissed the growls from his stomach. What will I do if I find his head beneath these vines? What if he opened his eyes and spoke to me? Oh my God, what would I do? The questions forced him to be still for a moment and listen more closely for the answers that seemed too improbable to consider, but the memory of his son led to the reality of his wife. She was still there, breathing, unconscious, very much alive, and the thought of her made him wince. She was grotesque, and now he would be burdened by her condition, enslaved by her dependency, and this he could not bear to consider. Damn her! His body shook with purpose, and his hand charged with an unexpected energy cut rapidly through the growth until he gripped the wrist of a left arm within a cluster of wood ferns. He wiped away flecks of dirt near the elbow, where he found what he had hoped, a semicircular childhood scar from a dog she had brought home from a shelter. The thing had been meant as an early birthday gift, his 11th, and had shown an initial devotion to their son, even taking to sleeping beside him in his bed, but apparently it had been traumatized by previous owners. For one night, when the boy's body lurched from a nightmare, the dog bit him, breaking the skin until the blood had soaked his sheets. She had fought to keep the dog, promising to train it, but a few weeks later, when they were not in the house, he put it in his car, drove it deep into the country, and released it. He moved his fingers slowly over the scar until the memory faded, and after wiping the tears with his sleeve, he gently placed the arm in the sea bag. Only a few seconds later, he heard a faint, high-pitched howl echo from somewhere beyond the forest, from the direction of the house. But undaunted, he returned to his knees, almost gliding across the forest floor. At the edge of a small clearing, he saw a decayed tree, its trisected crown blackened by lighting and its limbs pointing lifelessly toward the ground. He moved toward it feverishly, focusing on its gaping, hollow trunk and the barely discernible pile of decomposed leaves therein. When he reached it, he heedlessly thrust his hands into the pile. Despite his fervor, the warmth of the skin and the tone of the muscles beneath startled him, forcing him to withdraw his hands and fall backward, pulling enough of the leaves with him to reveal his son's torso. After he dislodged it from the hollow, he cradled it in his arms and carried it to the sea bag, where he lowered it to the ground and leaned it upright against a tree. His hand trembled as he wiped away the clinging humus and leaves, and he found himself speaking softly, affectionately to it, as though this part was the whole of him. "I've got you, son. I've got you, and no one will take you from me again." With his right arm, he then guided it meticulous into the sea bag, adjacent to the arm, and pulled the drawstring. Overwhelmed by hunger and emotional exhaustion, he threw the bag over his right shoulder, picked up the mesquite, walked the cleared path to its entrance, and turned toward the shed. Almost liturgically, he placed the pieces in the coffin, joining each smoothed end so that when he stepped back, he could admire the headless, immaculate body. "I'll find you," he said, referring to the head but addressing the limbs and torso. "Then I'll have you back." He threw the blankets against the door and lowered himself onto them. For hours, he let his mind wander through the forest, where he found various unscathed versions of his son among the trees, crawling in diapers or camouflage, engaging invisible monsters or enemies, swinging from branches, until he joined each of them in sleep. Apart from the early afternoon light that streamed through the panoramic doors, the house was dark and cool, but he made sense of this when he remembered that she was incapacitated in the bedroom. He ate the hummus and pita bread quietly, thoughtfully, as he stared through the glass, and acquired a new appreciation for the mountainscape. For a moment, images from past nightmares tried to distract him, but they now seemed distorted, almost too nondescript to trouble him further, so he readily dismissed them. Yet he could not do the same for the image of her in their bed, incomplete beneath that vile blanket, silently demanding his attention. For several minutes he stood outside the door, finding no sound beyond that of the oscillating fan, so he entered with a sigh of reluctance and saw what he did not expect to see. Her head was on its side, facing his nightstand. Her uncovered eye was partially closed, and her mouth silently and rapidly gulped the air, as though she were suffocating. The top of the blanket rested beneath her chin, but the rest lay flat, formless against the bedsheets underneath. He walked to the bed and pulled it back to find that it covered nothing. Her body was gone. Part of him wondered whether he should feel something: grief, pity, horror, or even a semblance of love that had been lost for over a year now. No emotion came. He knelt by the bed and looked at the face that no longer resembled her. Devoid of words, he shifted his gaze to the widening pool of saliva that trickled down the pillow and tried to recover an image of her before the death of their son, before she had conditioned him to embrace an unknown war in an unforgiving land. This led him to the early years of their marriage, when life was nothing more than the world they had created together. Even after her discharge and the ensuing depression, the vulnerability in her eyes had emboldened him to adopt a long-neglected but traditional instinct to protect and provide that would inevitably revitalize their intimacy. Still, there came no emotion to charge the only words he found to speak at her. "You thought you could hide him from me, but I found him. I found him here in this forest. And when I find the last piece of him, I hope the last piece of you will be gone." As he stood, he saw her uncovered eye open fully and leer at him. In the moment before he turned to leave, before she resumed her attempts to breathe, and with the last of the energy that had sustained her, She curved her mouth into a smile. He walked the trail briskly, buoyed by a current of cool air that seemed to follow him at every turn. The machete was light in his hand and carved mercilessly through the resisting brambles and shrubs just beyond the hollow tree. But soon he worried that in his haste the blade might gash his son's head, so he threw it down, stepped deeper into an uncut area, and began trudging in ever-widening circles. After half an hour, his shin struck a hard object buried beneath a clump of hostas. It rolled forward slightly but remained hidden beneath the leaves. For a moment, he merely stood there, looking down but afraid to find what he had hoped was lying just beyond his feet. So much depends on this. My God, what does all this mean? Although he anticipated the moment, he found himself unprepared for the full range of emotions that accompanied it. There and then he wanted to cry, to laugh joyfully, to curse, and to bless God and her for both taking and returning his son. Finally, once the intensity waned, he knelt, delicately thread his hands through the flora, and lifted from their care an oblong stubbled head. Like all the other parts he had found in the forest, the end of the neck was smooth and undamaged, and the rest was covered in specks of dark, rich soil, which he carefully wiped away from the back of the head with a slow, trembling hand, almost reluctant to see the other side. The longer he held it, the heavier it became, and the fingers of his hand had already begun to feel for recognition, so he turned it toward him. Unshielded by the soil were the rounded brows, bow-shaped lips, and celestial nose that were genetically his own. Had the lids been open, he would have seen her amber eyes. "Welcome home," he whispered, "where you'll stay." He nestled the head in the crook of his right arm and gripped the flashlight and machete firmly in his left hand as he walked slowly along the path, thinking of nothing more than the last day he had carried his child in his arms, after they had found him in the middle of the night sleeping at the foot of their bed during a storm. By the time he reached the shed, both the sunlight and the memory faded, and the only sound was the song of a nearby hermit thrush. After placing the head on the blankets, he lifted the lid and regarded the body, noting how the smooth ends of each part almost touched, as though bonded by thick layers of transparent glue. The flesh was warm, but he expected this. He then carefully lowered the head to its proper position, instinctively pushing the skin of the neck onto the shoulder. When he stepped back, he smiled and said, "My God, I didn't think I'd ever see you again," and began to sob. "I've missed you so much." Through his tears, it appeared to him that the body was whole, and the way the hands turned upward beside the thighs resembled how one within a confined space might gesture to another that he wanted to be embraced. "I'm so sorry she did this to you," he said, his voice quavering. "I love you." He secured the lid and fastened the two latches at each end, but he did not cover it with the blankets, nor did he lock the shed behind him. Neither seemed necessary anymore. The house was cool and quiet, and smelled of timber. Rather than switch on ceiling lights, he used the flashlight to find matches and then lit several candles from the pantry that gave the rooms a different vibrancy. He walked through every space, unhurried, acquainting himself with the textures of walls and furnishings he had never bothered to appreciate. By candlelight, he made his way to the bedroom. At the end of the empty bed was the vulgar blanket. He dragged it with his foot across the floor to the closet, from which he took new bedsheets, and as he stretched them over the mattress, he wondered whether his dreams would be tranquil. Sunlight and the sounds of Titmus and Taudes woke him, but for several minutes he lay there, his body stretched across the bed, unperturbed, and merely listened. When he rose, it was with purpose. "Today I finish. Nothing else." The house was warm, so he dressed accordingly and ate only a piece of toast spread with strawberry jam before leaving. From the porch, the air had a peculiar, unumbable sweetness that intensified as he walked the flagstones, tapping each one with the tip of his machete. He made no plan to visit his son until later that evening, to tell him that he had finished carving a trail that would make him proud, but when he looked over at the shed to wave at the body therein, he saw that the door was open. The machete scratched against the last flagstone while he stood and tried to recall whether he had closed it properly. Deciding to close it later, once the trail was complete, he continued toward the bright, cleared entrance to his forest. The earth felt soft and pliable beneath his feet, and the air rustling below the canopy was cool and fragrant. Although he walked slowly, the path felt longer, more serpentine than he had remembered making it. Yet every gradual arc, every veer, was by his own hand and met with his approval. One part was noticeably darker. The proximity of the flanking trees and the way the remaining lower branches were entwined resembled a tunnel, from which flowed a steady stream of crisp air imbued with an aroma he could not name. He stopped some 30 yards from the mouth of the corridor, where a shadowed figure began walking toward him. Filtered light from above slowly washed away the shadows to reveal his son, who was wearing his winter clothes and holding his other machete. Beyond their control, each ran toward the other, surrendered his blade to the forest floor, and embraced. The fragrance of the air that permeated the trees and enveloped him and his son was now unmistakably fresh, newborn,